First, I want to thank the SPAFA organizers for developing this series and then for inviting me to be part of it. SPAFA has very long served as an important hub for research and also training in Southeast Asian archaeology, not just art. And we're very grateful that SPAFA has done as much as they have for our field. I must also thank my Southeast Asian colleagues, students, friends for more than 35 years of a very important education. It's different from the PhD, and in many ways, it's much deeper. Thanks also to the students I've taught in the United States, in Taiwan, and in Cambodia. Learning never ends, and as teachers, we should always be learning from our students. I'm grateful. And I send my greetings to many people in the audience. I snuck a peek at who's watching, and I'm glad to see you all here. Next, I have to say that following Professor Rosmi is always difficult because of the scope of her perspective and the insights she shares with her audiences. So let me start by saying I agree with everything she says. She has already alluded to the development of a wide range of analytical and methodological approaches in our field, and I hope that my talk will help us understand both advances and gaps in the field. She's also made a couple of points that form real themes for what I want to talk about tonight for me and today for many of you. The first is that, like she says, theory, methods, evidence, they all have to interact with each other as we do our research. And the second is that Southeast Asia does not look like other regions of the world, and that makes it interesting. It's not an area of cultural retardation, like Helen Mobius said in 1948. It's actually an area that's unique and whose research and whose histories should help global archaeology understand the diversity of what it means to be human. So building local histories is definitely one of our methodological goals. And I just wanted to say before I get started, please give me some forgiveness here because there are many different interesting projects. I have only been able to highlight a few. I don't talk about my own work for better or worse, but I wish I had 3 times as much time so I could showcase some other different projects. Now, I'll start with some ways that our region is wonderful from an archaeological viewpoint, and then I'll turn to critical gaps. So let's start with some things we can feel really good about. We have a deep and rich hominin evolutionary history. And the fact that we have been working on human evolution and on hominins for more than 140 years means that, 130 years, means that we know a lot and we actually are very good at certain kinds of methods. And also, I'd like to point out that we have the earliest narrative rock art in the world, and we should feel very proud of that. Of course, there are amazing methods that people are bringing to this work as well in Sulawesi and elsewhere. But I just have to show these pigs. Then I want to point out that Southeast Asia is unique in some ways, being a pioneer in the use of aerial archaeology. We did precede, in fact, the New World in using aerial archaeology systematically. I have to give credit to that man on the bottom, Victor Golubev, there in Cambodia. And of course, everyone knows about P.D.R. Williams Hunt and his work in the 1940s. So when you get excited about LiDAR, like Rasmi said, just remember that we have a very long and deep tradition of doing different kinds of remote sensing and aerial archaeology. And that does make us distinct in some ways. A couple of other points that are great about what we do. We have an embarrassment of first and second millennium CE excavated stoneware kilns. If you live in Thailand, you might know about the Thai kilns and maybe the Cambodian kilns. But I don't know about the kilns in Myanmar, and I really am not very familiar with the ones in Vietnam. So this map that I have here, which is from Don Hines' summary synthesis work, just shows you that we have a lot of these kilns. Now, some of them, like the Khmer kiln I'm showing to the right here because I work in Cambodia, are kilns that produce ceramics that were only for local consumption. But many of these kilns also produced our earliest regional trade wares, which brings me to the last thing that makes our area so amazing, and that is the number of shipwrecks we have. I have to include a picture of Bong Dizon because we've lost him recently, and it's really very sad for our field. But I should also point out that the richness of our shipwreck archaeology database and is just beginning to be tapped. We use good methods, but as Rasmi would say, we need to think about theory as well. So there are a lot of reasons why Southeast Asian archaeologists have something to be proud of. But I would also say that we have work ahead of us. And since I've been tasked with understanding critical gaps in Southeast Asian archaeological methodology, I I've thought a lot about this. And I think we first have to acknowledge three fundamental assumptions and then one central problem in our field. So the first of the three fundamental assumptions is that, like Ajahn Rasmi talked about, research questions should drive the methods we use. And what we find should reshape our research questions to better fit our data. Research questions can be framed by theory, but we shouldn't let theory overwhelm what we think we see in the archaeological record. In other words, we always have to privilege the archaeological record. And when we see patterns that don't fit our models, instead of trying to force our data into models that don't work, we should think, what are more appropriate models, right? So there's this relationship between research questions and method and data you can see here. The second is that theory and methods are intertwined. So we should always be selecting methods that suit our research questions instead of selecting methods just because they're available or they're new or they're cool. And sometimes that means reverting to very basic conventional approaches. But always the research question has to meet the method, right? And so if you want to know about subsistence, instead of rocketing directly to isotope studies, you should also do zooarchaeological work first, for example. We need to do that basic research, a point that Rasmi is making. There's just no substitute for high quality archaeological data. And that kind of work requires conventional archaeological research. It may be on log coffin tombs, where Professor Rasmi works. It may be on human burials. It may be on traditional sites, like in the Kelabit Highlands. But whatever it is, we need to develop expertise. We need to be able to run archaeological projects, not simply be specialists in one very narrow analytical specialty, if we want to contribute to Southeast Asian archaeology more broadly. The fundamental problem we have, and this is something that Rasmi talked about, and it emanates largely out of using Western models, is that many people privilege theoretical models over empirical data to frame our research questions. Excuse me, this is a problem people have noticed for a long time. Rasmi mentioned Karl Hutterer in that 1976 article. He was not the first, but to worry about it, but he was definitely the first to explicitly say that we need to take great care about using stage models of development based on diffusionist thought. In other words, thinking of bands, tribes, chiefdom states, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on, and looking at migration as a primary driver. So this kind of issue, this concern with somehow forcing our data into prior models, creates stifling paradigms. And you see this, and I cite Adam Brum and someone more, because they work with stone tools that are 800,000 years old. So it doesn't matter if your archaeological record is 600 years old or almost 1,000,000 years old, it's the same problem. And it doesn't matter whether you're trying to work with vegetal information or you're trying to work with languages, genes, and subsistence systems, right? It's very awkward, and we need to really attend to the fit between theoretical models and empirical data. This is not a new thing to say in any way. In fact, Mark Oxenham almost 10 years ago said, we really do need to move away from our current simplistic and restrictive models. So we all know this, but it's very hard to implement. Now, what do we mean by methods? I was asked to talk about critical gaps in methods, so I just made this up. Now, I talk about first a few examples of the methods that we use. And if you had to divide them into two basic kinds of methods, I would say there's conventional archaeological methods versus archaeological science. Each has its role. They're extremely important. And as Rasmi said, we've had great developments in archaeological science. But basic research, which relies on conventional archaeological methods, must be the foundation for additional technical studies. So I wanted to give a few examples of conventional archaeological methods that produce huge, well-documented data sets that have then been used for all kinds of advanced technical studies. So this is where I apologize for only using a few examples. I work in Cambodia, so I really can't resist using La'an Svian, which is a mid to Holocene cave site in northwest Cambodia. So yes, they definitely excavate and they talk about rocks, but they also are able to do advanced analyses and technical studies of the human remains they have to look at Hawaiian people and so on. But this work is facilitated because of the very careful long-term research program that's been undertaken at Langsbien. Most recently, by Heng Sopadi and Hubert Forestier. But before that, it was started in the 1960s by an earlier generation of French researchers. So this is a common motif that you see sites that have been excavated by multiple teams using very careful methods, developing big archaeological data sets. I used as another example here, An Son site in Neolithic Vietnam for the same reason. I do like it, of course, because I like pottery and it's got a great set of pottery, and Carmen Sargent has done great work I'll get back to later. But really, the advantage of the An Son site is that it's been excavated by multiple teams, Vietnamese, Japanese, and Australian, with different goals in mind, in fact, but they've produced large data sets. Again, very conventional work, which has then allowed them to go on from there and do advanced analytical techniques. So what do I mean by advanced analytical techniques? We usually call it archaeological science. Excuse me. And if you care very much about this, Ollie Price and Anna Willis, I've just published an article looking at archaeological science over what they say is a 70-year period in mainland Southeast Asia. And if you look at this particular graphic, what you'll see is that although in the 1960s or early 70s it started, we've really had an increase through time in that kind of work. So what do they mean when they talk about these methods? They're talking about high temperature technologies like metallurgy. And I wanted to talk very briefly, give the example of Melissa Cadet, who's a recent PhD from France. She worked with Nigel Cheng's research project on the Villa Bouli complex of metal production. So his excavations provided for her ample data to be able to both date sites, look at specific kinds of artifacts. In this case, these are called crucibles, but also mining sites. So she can look at the whole process from which they extract the raw material to the smelting and the materials they use to smelt to the objects that they make. And then from there, she's able to apply high-tech techniques. So all of this is possible because you have, as systematic as possible, archaeological fieldwork going on. So conventional work that's producing well-documented data sets that can then be used for analytical work later. Another variety of archaeological science with which I'm sure everyone's familiar because we're morbidly fascinated with it and because it's been the only subfield in Southeast Asia where we've had a critical mass of specialists who have talked about a large enough number of human osteological samples for us to start talking about regional comparisons. So bioarchaeology is what it's generally called. And people have done all kinds of studies, also contingent on well-excavated archaeological sites. So while you may yourself be fascinated by violence at a site like Pum Snai here in northwest Cambodia, and here's a healed, it's a healed destroyed eye, all right? Someone was hit in the eye and they lost their eye probably, and then during their lifetime, their socket healed and they continued, but it's a kind of trauma, which they interpret as violence. But you can also do very detailed studies to look for parodic hyperostosis that suggest thalassemia at many different sites, from Koc Phnom D to sites in Vietnam, right? So because we have a number of well-excavated sites, specialists can come in and they can do the methods work. Which brings us to regional site detection, which everyone seems to love these days. And because I was working with the Greater Angkor project at the time LiDAR came out, I was familiar with it. In fact, I was sitting there with Damien as the first processed LiDAR images showed up. And it is great and it is exciting. But as any good field archaeologist will tell you, even a really nice map like this is not enough. You cannot understand this 9 kilometer square area city that is Angkor Thom unless you do excavations. And so, in fact, there is an archaeologist who spent more than a decade excavating in it. And when you combine the excavations with the high-tech approaches, then we start to learn really interesting kinds of findings. Now, you may or may not be familiar with conventional techniques of archaeological science like archaeobotany, palynology, and phytolith. This just gives you an example of the kind of glop that archaeobotanists like to look at. And here are phytoliths, and here's Lisa Kellifer. Sorry, these are pollen, I'm sorry, pollen grains. And then here's Lisa Kellifer at, I think, Lake Kumpuampi, extracting a core from which she'll get phytoliths. We can learn a lot about the environment. And I think of it as pretty basic research. And one critical gap is that we don't have enough specialists who do this work. I could go on and on. I could talk about ceramic analysts and how much work we need and how many more trained ceramic analysts we need. I could talk about zooarchaeology. But the main point is just that the most successful technical studies use materials from well-excavated archaeological sites. So as long as we have people who are trained in basic techniques, doing culture history is a good thing. What Rasmi is saying is it's not sufficient on its own, but you need to start with good culture history and developing site chronologies. And I also just wanted to use the site of Tabon Caves as an example of a site that was excavated 60 years ago, but even in the last 5 years and 10 years is now churning out wonderful kinds of studies by more than a dozen different people on everything from plant technology to basket and rope making and stable isotopes in guano. There's a lot that you can learn from these sites. We call them legacy collections. But we need to make sure that in our excitement to use all of these hyper new techniques and starch analysis, we still spend time documenting sites adequately to help researchers in the future. Okay, so those are a lot of the methods we use, not all of them, of course, but I was asked to talk about critical gaps in Southeast Asian archaeological methodology. So Professor Rosby and I talked quite a bit about this. And really, I came up with a few points. The first is that we do, like she said, focus too much on culture historical approaches. On the one hand, we forget to use theory and we just work on a site and get radiocarbon dates. On the other hand, maybe we work on a bunch of sites, but we lapse into arguments about the first and the earliest and believe that that's a sufficient research question. I would argue that that's almost never a sufficient research question, except insofar as we use it to understand catalysts for organizational change. Why do I say that? Arguing about the earliest agriculture or the earliest metal is sure to get you in trouble. Here's an example I pulled up today. This is from March 17th, 2025. And it turns out that, in fact, the earliest dates for metallurgy suddenly are a few thousand years earlier than we thought. So just trying to find the earliest is always going to be a bad idea because someone will find something earlier. And the other issue about it is just looking for the earliest isn't really so interesting. What's interesting is trying to understand why the adoption of these early technologies, for example, the shift from hunting to farming, how it happened, what were the interactions between these people when they were exposed to new technologies. I would say the next problem, and I hope I don't step on toes here, is that many of us archaeologists just aren't very confident. We defer to specialists in other fields to develop research questions for us instead of deciding what we want to study and then working with specialists to answer our research questions. So, for example, we revere geneticists, and geneticists are great at doing genetics, but they're not great at asking appropriate archaeological questions. If we ask them questions, then they'll just answer them. But we need to think about what it is we want to know. Is it really as simple as a 2-layer migration hypothesis? Might we find more complex ways to think about dynamics in the past? And at its worst, and I'm very sorry to have to show this, we have examples like Gunung Padang, where we have a perfectly interesting archaeological site, in fact, and a very well excavated archaeological site. but a deference to geologists to interpret the archaeological record. So that, in fact, if you read their article, most of it makes great sense. The problem is that you can't associate the dates with these archaeological or cultural developments. And that's why it got retracted. And I felt when I learned about this particular controversy that this was a case where people were bowled over by extraordinarily gifted geologists. It's not their fault. We need to be brave and we need to be confident. Finally, we just lack sufficient basic research in key cultural materials, archaeobotanical, zooarchaeological, ceramic, to make meaningful comparative studies to characterize subregions through time. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that you don't get a lot of credit for doing a ceramic analysis. I understand that. And it's a big challenge to get people to focus on only ceramic analysis or just doing faunal analysis of a site when they could maybe be off doing isotope work on their bones, or they could be doing chemical compositional analysis on their ceramics. But the problem is, if we don't have enough well described assemblages, we can't make comparisons. So I want to use two examples here of people who I think have done extraordinarily strong ceramic work. And forgive me again for using two examples from the mainland. It is true that I'm more familiar with it, and I also work with these people. So when Tirikamo Onsuwan Ayer did her dissertation, she combined her work with, which was archaeological survey, with very well documented archaeological collections from multiple sites in her area. And because of that, so I was able to take a research question, which was, can we see the development of essentially village-based specialization and sub-regional identities during the Metal Age in central Thailand? And she used ceramic analysis and decorative variability and settlement patterns, all of this, to come up with a very interesting result, right? She could do comparison because of the work that had been done at all these sites. You can see Kokcharoen from a long time ago, along with Sub Champa, Chaibadan, and the whole Thai archaeometallurgical project sites at Chonsen and Take. So because there were so many collections, she was able to do very useful work, but it's in a very, very geographically small area. To give credit to another extraordinary ceramicist, Carmen Sargent here was able to look from the site of Anson, here it is, and I already talked about it, and use decorative variability to try to understand regional patterning. This is great. And she talked about geometric impressions, eye-shaped incisions, hollow circle, pun-take stamping, and so on. All of this is great, and I could show you her examples. But what I want to show you instead is that she only had really systematic work from 4 other sites, right? And so how different might this look if we had other very systematically studied ceramic collections? So at the level of a subregion, we can say a lot, but we need to do much more systematic basic work so that we can start talking about broad trends. And without that, the kinds of articles that come out and say, oh, we have great evidence of aggrandizing individuals in the Bronze Age based on my one site in Northeast Thailand, they're not very interesting to people who work in other parts of the world because we don't know how representative it is. So we also have too few regional archaeological surveys to compare regions within Southeast Asia and too little technical expertise to make these comparisons. So as one more example, this is horrible. I'm sorry that I'm saying this about people. This was a really great project by Caitlin Evans, and she worked also with Nigel Cheng, published in 2016, where she used the results of a very comprehensive archaeological survey program in the Upper Mun River, which is UMRV here, and she compared it with central Thailand and the Mekong Delta. Which is great, and I loved the article. We published it in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. But you can see that the areas directly around her also lacked archaeological survey that would have been super interesting. And as much as I like the site Angkor Barai where I worked, and Sambor Prekuk, which is a World Heritage Site, Angkor Barai is 700 kilometers from her research area. Ensemble Praecoca 500 kilometers, which suggests that we need more systematic work. And survey work isn't very sexy, but it's very important to do it. So I guess this is a plea more than anything for people to do much more work that is systematic and basic in order to facilitate the kind of technical studies that are important for later. So I guess in some ways I'm prefiguring what I was saying. We definitely need to respect the region's local conditions. That comes back to asking questions that make sense in a tropical environment, not trying to bring in models that aren't going to work because they're from the mid-latitudes of Europe and the Middle East. We need to fit the methods and the theory to the data. And we need to do more basic archaeological work. There's just no substitute for high quality archaeological data, which requires conventional archaeological research. And I guess I'd like to finish here by just giving credit to the dozens and dozens of archaeological teams working all over Southeast Asia, doing really good work, really hard work in very challenging conditions to produce the kind of basic research that is foundational to us filling these critical gaps. Thank you very much.